Zebulun, Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Good evening, friend. We're going to be continuing our discussion here on this fascinating book we've been covering for a couple weeks now, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And as I've stated before, the reason I feel like we should be talking about this book is because it is a second look at the Federal Reserve. And we've already been, in like the news and in the zeitgeist or whatever, talking about the Federal Reserve, and I believe it's they're talking about them going to be raising interest rates like 11 more times within the next 2 years and all this stuff. I think that it's going to be needed for us to understand the Fed a little bit more than I do or did. So I picked up this book, and we're just going to continue to go through it. So. We're not reading it all the way through like we would do normal books that are, in the public domain. They've been around for, a bunch of years, and no one really owns the copyrights to them anymore or whatever. That's usually how we handle our coverage of books. This one's different, so I'm cherry picking and going through and highlighting certain things. So if it seems a little bit different, that's why. But I think that we're just going to jump right back into where we left off last week. We were talking about how under this modern monetary theory, taxes aren't even necessary. Why do they keep taxing us if they could just print all the money they want? That's what I want to know. God damn it. So before we get started, I do have my vessel of the art here, and it is topped to the brim with my formula for weapon of mass distraction, the Jin Jihad. And let me just kick this. Let's start this party off right, and we can get going. Also, I need to double check my levels. There was something off with last week's show. Let me make sure we're all pumped up here. G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Make no mistake about it, inflation is a tax. Furthermore, it is the most unfair tax of them all because it falls most heavily upon those who are thrifty, those on fixed incomes, and those in the middle and lower income brackets. The important point here is that this hidden tax would be impossible without fiat money. Fiat money in America is created solely as the result of the Federal Reserve System. Therefore, it is totally accurate to say that the Federal Reserve System generates the most unfair tax. Both the tax and the system that makes it possible should be abolished. You got Ron Paul and Rand Paul out there saying, we got to audit the Fed. And I'm like, yeah, I'm on board. Let's do it. The political scientists who authorize this process of monetizing the national debt and the monetary scientists who carry it out know that it is not true debt. It is not true debt because no one in Washington really expects to repay it ever. Remember, in one of the previous episodes, the plan was bailouts forever. That's what this whole thing is based on, the foundation of the system. It's too big to fail, don't you know? Wall Street's too big to fail. The dual purpose of this magic show is simply to create free spending money for the politicians without the inconvenience of raising direct taxes, and also to generate a perpetual river of gold flowing into the banking cartel. The partnership is merely looking out for itself. Why, then, does the federal government bother with taxes at all? Why not just operate on monetized debt? The answer is twofold. First, if it did, people would begin to wonder about the source of all that money. And that might cause them to wake up to reality that inflation is a tax. Thus, open taxes at some level serve to perpetuate public ignorance, which is essential to the success of the scheme. The second reason is that taxes, particularly progressive taxes, are weapons by which elitist social planners can wage war on the middle class. What do you mean? You might be asking yourself. It's a tool for social planning. January 1946, in an issue of American Affairs, carried an article written by Beardsley Rummel, who at the time was chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Rummel had devised the system of automatic withholding during World War II, so he was well qualified to speak on the nature and the purpose of the federal income tax. This theme was spelled out in the title of his article. Taxes for revenue are obsolete. 1946, this fucker was talking about this. His thesis is that given control of the central banking system and an incontrovertible currency, a currency not backed by gold, fiat currency, you must use it, slave. A sovereign national government is finally free of money worries and need no longer levy taxes for the purpose of providing itself with revenue. All taxation, therefore, should be regarded from the point of view of social and economic consequences. When I was growing up, the first time that I heard of this being talked about was, it was Slick Willie, Bill Clinton. What was he doing? It was a marriage. It was something about marriage taxes. I can't remember the particulars of it, but he was making an incentive. Rummel explained that since the Federal Reserve now can create out of nothing all the money the government could ever want, there remains only two reasons to have taxes at all. First of these is to combat a rise in the general level of prices. His argument was that when people have money in their pockets, they will spend it for goods and services, and thus will bid up the prices. The solution, he says, is to take money away from them through taxation and let the government spend it instead. This too will bid up the prices, but Rummel chose not to go into that. He explained his theory this way. I was thinking about trying to do an accent, but I don't think I'm going to do it. The dollars the government spends becomes purchasing power in the hands of the people who have received them. The dollars the government takes by taxes cannot be spent by the people, and therefore these dollars can no longer be used to acquire the things which are available for sale. Taxation is therefore an instrument of the first importance of the administration of any physical and monetary policy. We're going to get to what that is here in a second. I just wanted to say, years and years ago, you were able to like pull up and see the stuff that, like, it was with one of the big earmark debates, and we were able to see like a list of shit the government was spending money on. It was ridiculous. It was like, are frogs gay? There was a grant for creating treadmills for crabs or something. It was like the list, the cornucopia of stupid bullshit that the government funds with, quote, your tax dollars, unquote, is ridiculous. There is no normal person that would spend money on building treadmills for sand crabs. No one. No person on Earth. Let me restate. Normal person on Earth would fund a study to see if frogs were gay. Like, just go watch the good Jurassic Park movie. It explains the frog sexuality thing just fine. With the lysine deficiency, you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to back up just a little bit to ease into this the right way. The dollars the government spends becomes purchasing power in the hands of the people who have received them. The dollars the government takes by taxes cannot be spent by the people, and therefore these dollars can no longer be used to acquire the things which are available for sale. Taxation is therefore an instrument of the first importance in the administration of any physical and monetary policy. The redistribution of wealth. The other purpose of taxation, according to Rummel, is to redistribute the wealth from one class of citizen to another. This must always be done in the name of social justice or equality. This book was written, if I remember correctly, in 1996. That's when it was published, at least. Hold on, let me check. It's like ripped straight from the headlines. 94. Copyright, 1994. The other purpose of taxation, according to Rummel, is to redistribute the wealth from one class of citizen to another. This must always be done in the name of social justice or equality. But the real objective is to override the free market and to bring society under the control of the master planners. Rummel said, the second principal purpose of federal taxes is to attain more equality of wealth and of income that would result from economic forces working alone. The taxes which are effective for this purpose are the progressive individual income tax, the progressive estate tax, and the gift tax. What these taxes should be depends on public policy with respect to the distribution of wealth and of income. These taxes should be defended and attacked in terms of their effect on the character of American life, not as revenue measures. As we have seen, Senator Nelson Aldrich was one of the creators of the Federal Reserve System. That is not surprising in light of the cartel nature of the system and the financial interests which he represented. Aldrich was also one of the prime sponsors of the federal income tax. Two creations work together as a far more deliberate mechanism to control over the economic and social life of society than either one alone. In more recent years, there's been hopeful evidence that the master planners were about to abandon Rummel's blueprint. What is going on here? We have heard a great deal both in Congress and at the Federal Reserve about the necessity of reducing expenses so as to diminish the growth of the federal debt and inflation. But it has been lip service only. The great bulk of the federal funding continues to be created by the Mandrake mechanism. The cost of government continues to outpace tax revenues, and the Rummel formula reigns supreme. I've often wondered about this. You know, the word like billion and trillion, like those words were invented for astronomy, for like astrophysics, not the economy. Expansion leads to contraction. While it is true that the Mandrake mechanism is responsible for the expansion of money supply, the process also works in reverse. Just as money is created when the Federal Reserve purchases bonds or other debt instruments, it is extinguished by the sale of those same items. When they are sold, the money is given back to the system and disappears into the inkwell or the computer chip from which it came. Then the same secondary ripple effects that created money throughout the commercial banking system caused it to be withdrawn from the economy. Furthermore, even if the Federal Reserve does not deliberately contract the money supply, the same result can, and often does, occur when the public decides to resist the availability of credit and to reduce its debt. A man can only be tempted to borrow. He cannot be forced to do so. There are psychological factors involved in the decision to go into debt that can offset the easily available money and the low interest rate. A downturn in the economy, a threat to civil disorder, a fear of pending war, an uncertain political climate, to name just a few. Check, 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 check. Even though the Fed may try to pump money into the economy by making it abundantly available, you know, like sending you $2,000 checks you can't opt out of for no reason at all. The public can thwart that move simply by saying no, thank you. When this happens, the old debts that are being paid off are not replaced by the new ones to take their place, and the entire amount of consumer and business debt will shrink. That means the money supply also will shrink, because in modern America, debt is money. And it is this very expansion and contraction of the monetary pool, a phenomenon that could not occur if based upon the laws of supply and demand. That is the very core of practically every boom and bust that has plagued mankind throughout history. In conclusion, it can be said that modern money is a grand illusion conjured by the magicians of finance and politics. We are living in an age of fiat money, and it is sobering to realize that every previous nation in history has adopted such money eventually was economically destroyed by it. Furthermore, there is nothing in our present monetary structure that offers any assistance that we may be exempted from that morbid roll call. Correction, there is one. It is still within the power of Congress to abolish the Federal Reserve. The American dollar has no intrinsic value. It is a classic example of fiat money with no limit to the quantity that can be produced. Its primary value lies in the willingness of people to accept it. To that end, legal tender law requires them to do so. It is true that our money is created out of nothing, but it is more accurate to say that it is based upon debt. In one sense, therefore, our money is created out of less than nothing. The entire money supply would vanish into bank vaults and computer chips if all debts were repaid. Under the present system, therefore, our leaders cannot allow a serious reduction in either the national or the consumer debt. Payments of interest on pretend loans is usury, and that has become institutionalized under the Federal Reserve System. This Mandrake mechanism by which the Fed converts debt into money may seem complicated at first, but it is simple if one remembers that the process is not intended to be logical, but to confuse. and deceive. The end product of the mechanism is artificial expansion of the money supply, which is the root cause of the hidden tax called inflation. This expansion then leads to contraction, and together they produce the destructive boom-bust cycle that has plagued mankind through history wherever fiat money has existed. This reminds me, do you remember Avengers 2, The Age of Ultron, where he like blanks out and he's like, Ultron does, and he's like, he goes into the internet or something and transfers like $1 gajillion to somebody. He's like, finances are so weird. The new alchemy. The ancient alchemists sought in vain to convert lead into gold. Modern alchemists have succeeded in that quest. The lead bullets of war have yielded an endless source of gold for those magicians who control the mandrake mechanism. The startling fact that emerges that without the ability to create fiat money, most modern wars simply would not have occurred. As long as the mechanism is allowed to function, the future wars are inevitable. This is the story of how that came to pass. We're going to skip through, hit some highlights here. Chapter 11, The Rothschilds Formula. The rise of the House of the Rothschilds in Europe, the tradition among financiers of profiting from both sides of armed conflict, the formula in which war is converted into debt and debt converted back into war. So remember, another $40 billion in aid going to the Ukraine. Keep that in the back of your mind as we're going through this. So far as we adhere closely to the subject of money and the history of its manipulation by political and monetary scientists, now we are going to take a short detour along a parallel path and view some of the same historical scenery from a different perspective. As we progress, it may seem that we have lost our way, and you may wonder what connection any of this can possibly have with the Federal Reserve System. Please be assured, however, that it has everything to do with it, and when we finally return to that topic, the connection will have become painfully clear. The focus of this chapter is on the profits of war, and more specifically, the tendency of those who reap those profits to manipulate governments into military conflicts, not for national or patriotic reasons, but for private gain. The mechanism by which this was accomplished in the past was more complex than simply lending money to warring governments and then collecting interest. Although it was part of it, the real payoff has always been in the form of political favoritism in the marketplace. Writing in the year 1937, French historian, Richard Louis explains, although often called bankers, those who financed wars in the pre-capitalist period were not bankers in the modern sense of the word. Unlike modern bankers who operate with money deposited with them by their clients, they generally worked on the fortune which they themselves had amassed or inherited, in which they lent the highest rate of interest. Those who risked the financing of war were, for the most part, already very rich. And this was the case down into the 17th century. When they agreed to finance war, these rich lenders did not, however, always attach great importance to the rate of interest. In this respect, they often showed the greatest compliance to their august clients, but in return, they secured for themselves privileges, which could be turned into industrial or commercial profits, such as mining concessions, monopolies of sales or importation. Sometimes even they were given the right to appropriate certain taxes as the guarantee of their loan. So through the loan itself carried a very real risk and often did not bring much interest. The indirect profits were very considerable, and the lender's leniency was well rewarded. the Rothschild dynasty. No discussion of banking as a mechanism for financing wars would be complete without turning eventually to the name Rothschild. It was Mayor Amschel Rothschild who was quoted as saying, quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws," unquote. Biographer Frederick Morton concluded that the Rothschild dynasty had, quote, "conquered the world more thoroughly, more cunningly, and much more lastingly than all the Caesars before or all the Hitlers after them," unquote. The dynasty was begun in Frankfurt, Germany, in the middle of the 18th century by Mayor Amschel Bauer. The son of goldsmith Mayer became clerk of the Oppenheimer Bank in Hanover and was eventually promoted to junior partner. After his father's death, he returned home in Frankfurt to continue the family business. Over the door hung a red shield with an eagle as a sign to identify the establishment. The German word for red shield is Rothschild, and he changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild, and added 5 gold arrows held in the talons of the eagle to represent the 5 sons. Rothschild even began when Mayer adopted the practice of fractional reserve banking. As we have seen, he was not alone in this, but the House of Rothschild greatly surpassed his competition. That was due to his sharp business acumen and also because of his 5 most unusual sons, all of whom became financial power centers of their own. As they matured and learned the magic of converting debt into money, they moved beyond the confines of Frankfurt and established additional operations in the financial centers, not only of Europe, but much of the civilized world. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the brothers conducted important transactions on behalf of the governments of England, France, Prussia, Australia, Belgium, Spain, Naples, Portugal, Brazil, various German states, and other smaller countries. They were the personal bankers of many of the crowned heads of Europe. They made large investments through agents in markets as distant as the U.S., India, Cuba, and Australia. They were financiers to Cecil Rhodes, making it possible for him to establish a monopoly over the diamond fields of South Africa. They are still connected with De Beers. Biographer Derek Wilson writes, "Those who lampooned or vilified the Rothschilds for their sinister influence had considerable amount of justification for their anger and their anxiety. The banking community had always constituted a fifth estate, those whose members were able, by control of the royal purse strings, to effect important events. But it was the House of Rothschilds was immensely... Sorry, but I'm having a real hard time because of the Red Shields thing. But the House of Rothschild was immensely more powerful than any financial empire that had ever preceded it. It commanded vast wealth. It was international. It was independent. Royal governments were nervous of it because they could not control it. Popular movements hated it because it was not answerable to the people. Constitutionalists resented it because its influence was exercised behind the scenes, secretly. Secrecy, of course, is essential for the success of a cabal, and the Rothschilds perfected the art. By remaining behind the scenes, they were able to avoid the brunt public anger, which was directed instead at the political figures which they largely controlled. This is a technique which had been practiced by financial manipulators ever since it was fully utilized by those who operated the Federal Reserve System today. Wilson continues, clandestinely was and remained clandestinity was and remained a feature of the Rothschilds' political activity. Seldom were they to be seen engaging in open public debate on important issues. Never did they seek government office. Even when, in later years, some of them entered Parliament, they did not feature prominently in the assembly chambers of London, Paris, or Berlin. Yet all the while, they were helping to shape the major events of the day by granting or withholding funds, by providing statesmen with an official diplomatic service, by influencing appointments to high office, and by an almost daily intercourse with the great decision makers. Continual war in Europe created excellent opportunities for profit from smuggling scarce consumer goods past military blockades. Since the Rothschilds were financed both sides in a conflict, they were known to have a great political influence. The mere sight of the red shield on a leather pouch, a carriage, or a ship's flag was sufficient to ensure that the messenger or his cargo could pass through checkpoints in either direction. This immunity allowed them to deal with the thriving black market for cotton goods, yarn, tobacco, coffee, sugar, and indigo. They moved freely through the borders of Germany, Scandinavia, Holland, Spain, England, France. The government protection was one of those indirect benefits that generated commercial profits far in the excess of interest received in the underlying government loans. It is generally true that one man's loss is another man's gain, and even in the friendliest of biographers admit that for more than 2 centuries the House of Rothschild profited handsomely from wars and economic collapses and every occasions on which others sustained the greatest losses. So I'm going to jump here. I want to find, there's a list of wars in Europe that took place before World War I. And the reason I'm talking about that is because it's going to get spicy here in the next episode. I think when we start talking about World War I, World War I was basically a giant fight between the Rothschilds. So there's perpetual war in 18th century England. Wars, great and small, have always been a plague to Europe, but it was not until they were easy to finance through the central banking and fiat money that they became virtually perpetual. For example, the following War Chronicles begins immediately following the formation of the Bank of England, which, as you recall, was created for the specific purpose of financing war. 1689 to 97, the War of the League of Augsburg. 1702 to 1713, the War of Spanish Succession. This one sounds interesting. I should look at this. 1739 to 1742, the War of Jenkins' Ear. 1744 to 1748, the War of Austrian Succession. 1754 to 1736, the French and Indian War, which hits home. Here in Pittsburgh, I'm surrounded by stuff from the French and Indian War. 1793 to 1801, the war against revolutionary France. 1803 to 1815, the Napoleonic War. In addition to these European conflicts, there were also 2 wars with America, the War for Independence and the War of 1812, which was the War for Independence, Part 2. This time, it's personal. In the 126 years between 1689 and 1815, England was at war 63 of them. That is 1 out of every 2 years in combat. The others were spent preparing for combat. The mark of the Rothschilds' formula is unmistakable in these conflicts. The monetary scientists often were seen financing both sides, whether ending in victory or defeat. The outcome merely preserved the restored the European, quote, balance of power, unquote. And the most permanent result of any of these wars was expanding government debt for all parties. So let's talk about Napoleon versus the bankers. Now, we're going to skip that. We're shotgun through this thing. By the end of the 18th century, the House of Rothschild had become one of the most successful financial institutions the world had ever known. Its meteoric rise can be attributed to the great industry and shrewdness of the five brothers who established themselves in various capitals of Europe and forged the world's first international financial network as pioneers in the practice of lending money to governments. They soon learned that this provided unique opportunities to parlay wealth into political power as well. Before long, most of the princes and kings of Europe had come within their influence. The Rothschilds also had mastered the art of smuggling on a grand scale, often with the tacit approval of the governments whose laws they violated. This was perceived by all parties as an unofficial bonus for providing needed funding to those same governments, particularly in the time of war. The fact that different branches of the Rothschilds network also might be providing funds for the enemy was pragmatically ignored. Thus, a time-honored practice among financiers was born, profiting from both sides. The Rothschilds operated a highly efficient intelligence gathering system which provided them with advanced knowledge of important events, knowledge which was invaluable for investment decisions. When an exhausted Rothschild courier delivered the first news of the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan, who was able to deceive the London bond traders into a selling panic, and that allowed him to acquire the dominant holding of England's entire debt, but at a tiny fraction of its worth. A study of these and similar events reveals a personality profile, not just of the Rothschilds, but of that special breed of international financiers whose success typically is built upon certain character traits. Those include cold objectivity, immunity to patriotism, and indifference to the human condition. That profile is the basis for proposing a theoretical strategy called the Rothschild's formula, to motivate such men to propel governments into war for the profits they yield. The formula most likely has never been consciously phrased as it appears here, but subconscious motivations and the personality traits work together to implement it. And nevertheless, as long as the mechanism of the central banking exists, there will be to such men an irresistible temptation to convert debt into perpetual war, and war into perpetual debt. The following chapters, we shall track the distinctive footprint from the Rothschild's formula as it leads up to our own doorstep in this present day. Sink the Lusitania. The role of J.P. Morgan in providing loans to England and France in World War I, the souring of those loans as it became apparent that Germany would win, the betrayal of the British ship, and the sacrifice of the American passengers as a stratagem to bring America into the war. The use of American taxes to pay off those loans. The origins of World War I is usually attributed to an assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist in 1914. This was a serious affront to Austria, but hardly a sufficient reason to plunge the world into a mortal conflict that would claim over 10 million lives and 20 million wounded. The American school children are taught that Uncle Sam came into the war to make the world safe for democracy. But as we shall see, the American war drums were pounded by men with far less idealistic objectives. Since the latter part of the 18th century, the Rothschilds formula had controlled the political climate of Europe. Nations had increasingly confronted each other over border disputes, colonial territories, and trade routes. An arms race had been in progress for many years. Large standing armies had been recruited and trained. Military alliances had been hammered together, all in preparation for war. The assassination of Ferdinand was not the cause, but the trigger. It was merely the spark that lit the fuse that fired the first loaded cannon. An investment in war. The exegesis of war in Europe required England and France to go heavily into debt. When their respective central banks and local merchant banks could no longer meet that need, the beleaguered governments turned to the Americans. This selected the House of Morgan, acting as partners of the Rothschilds, to act as a sales agent for their bonds. Most of the money raised in this fashion was quickly returned to the United States to acquire war-sensitive materials, and Morgan was selected as the U.S. purchase agent for those as well. A commission was paid on all transactions in both directions. Once the money was borrowed and again when it was spent, furthermore, many of the companies receiving production contracts were either owned outright by Morgan, holding companies, or were secured within his orbit of bank control. Under such an agreement, it will not be surprising to learn that we shall, in a moment, that Morgan was not overly anxious to see hostilities come to a close. Even the most honorable of men can be corrupted by the temptation of such gigantic flows of cash. The money began to flow in January of 1915 when the House of Morgan signed a contract with the British Army Council and Admiralty. The first purchase, cautiously, was for horses, and the amount tendered was $12 million. That was just but the first drop of rain before the deluge. The total purchase would eventually climb to an astronomical $3 billion. The firm became the largest consumer on Earth, spending up to $10 million per day. Morgan offices at 23 Wall Street were mobbed by brokers and manufacturers seeking to cut a deal. The bank had to post guards at every door and at the partners' homes as well. Each month, Morgan presided over purchases which were equal to the gross national product of the entire world just one generation before. Throughout all this, Morgan vigorously claimed to be a pacifist. Nobody could hate war more than I do, he told the Senate Munitions Committee. But such professions of righteousness were difficult to accept. We're going to jump ahead here a little bit. A secret agreement to get U.S. into the war. Presidential election neared for Wilson's second term. This is Woodrow Wilson. He looks like the Count from Sesame Street. He was a real asshole. Anyhow, he ran for a second term as keeping America out of the war. That's what he ran on. And then as soon as he got in there, he was like, okay, all right, get everybody together. We're getting into this war. Colonel House entered into a series of confidential talks with Sir William Wiseman, who was attached to the British Embassy in Washington, and who acted as a secret intermediary between the House and British foreign offices. Charles Seymour writes, between the House and Wiseman, there were soon to be a few political secrets. This was upsetting to the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. You guys know who that is? I'm curious if you guys know who William Jennings Bryan is. I don't know. Don't Google it. Don't Google it right off the bat. Go hit up Drunk History and find the William Jennings Bryan, the Scopes Monkey Trial episode. While Secretary Bryan was dealing with heavy responsibility of the Department of State, he arose the curious conditions surrounding Mr. E.M. House's unofficial connection with the president and his voyages abroad on affairs of state, which were not communicated to Secretary Bryan. The president was unofficially dealing with foreign governments. What was the purpose of these dealings? It was nothing less than to work out the means whereby the United States could be brought into the war. Viereck explains, 10 months before the election which returned Wilson to the House, the White House in 1916, because he kept us out of the war. Colonel House negotiated a secret agreement with England and France on behalf of Wilson, which pledged the United States to intervene on behalf of the Allies. On March 9, 1916, Woodrow Wilson formally sanctioned the undertaking. If an inkling of the conversations between Colonel House and the leaders of England and France had reached the American people before the election, it might have caused incalculable revulsions of public opinion. From the conversations, the various conferences with Sir Edmund Grey, and a secret treaty was made without the knowledge and the consent of the United States Senate, by which Woodrow Wilson, the House, chained the United States to the chariot of Entente. After the war, the text of the agreement leaked out. Grey was the first to tattle. Page discussed at length. Colonel House tells its history. C. Hartland Groton discusses it in length with his book, Why We Fought. But for some incomprehensible reason, the enormous significance of the revelation never penetrated the consciousness of the American people. The basic terms of the agreement were that the United States government would offer to negotiate peaceful settlement between Germany and the Allies, and would then put forth specific proposal in terms of the settlement. If either side refused to accept the proposal, then the United States would come into the war as an ally of the other side. The catch was that the terms of the proposal were carefully drafted so that Germany could not possibly accept them. Thus, to the world, it would look as though Germany was at fault and the United States was this humanitarian, as Ambassador Page observed. So let's just get to the end of this thing. I'm sorry. Please. I need to load up some hold music. To finance the early stages of World War I, England and France had borrowed heavily from investors in America. They had selected the House of Morgan as sales agent for their bonds. Morgan also acted as U.S. purchasing agent for war materials, thus profiting from both ends of the cash flow. Once when the money was borrowed and again when it was spent, further profits were derived from the production contracts placed with companies within the Morgan orbit. But the war began to go badly for the Allies when Germany's submarines took virtual control over the Atlantic shipping lanes. As England and France moved closer to defeat or towards a negotiated peace on Germany's terms, it became increasingly difficult to sell their bonds. No bonds meant no purchases. The Morgan cash flow was threatened. Furthermore, if the previously sold bonds should go into default, they certainly would in the wake, as they certainly would in the wake of defeat, the Morgan consortium would suffer gigantic losses. The only way to save the British Empire was to restore the value of the bonds, and to sustain the Morgan cash flow was for the United States government to provide the money. But since neutral nations were prohibited from doing that in a treaty, America would have to be brought into the war. A secret agreement to that effect was made between the British officials and Colonel House, with the concurrence of the president. From that point forward, Wilson began to pressure Congress for a declaration of war. This was done at the very time he was campaigning for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Meanwhile, Morgan purchased control over major segments of the news media and engineered a nationwide editorial blitz against Germany, calling for war as an act of American patriotism. Morgan had created an international shipping cartel, including Germany's merchant fleet, which maintained a near monopoly on the high seas. Only on the British Cunard line remained aloof. The Lusitania was owned by Cunard and operated in competition with Morgan's cartel. The Lusitania was built to military specifications and was registered with the British Admiralty as an armed auxiliary cruiser. She carried passengers as a cover to conceal her real mission, which was to bring contraband war materials from the United States. This fact was known to Wilson and others in his administration, but they did nothing to stop it. When the German embassy tried to publish a warning to American passengers, the State Department intervened and prevented newspapers from printing it. How far shit changes, it all stays the same, right? When the Lusitania left New York Harbor on her final voyage, she was virtually a floating ammunition depot. The British knew that to draw the United States into war would mean the difference between defeat and victory, and anything that could accomplish that was proper. Even the coldly calculated sacrifice of one of her great ships with Englishmen on board. But the trick was to have Americans on board also in order to create the proper emotional climate in the United States. As the Lusitania moved into hostile waters where a German U-boat was known to be operating, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill ordered her destroyer protection to abandon her. This, plus the fact that she had been ordered to travel at a reduced speed, made her an easy target. After the impact of one well-placed torpedo, a mighty second explosion from within ripped her apart, and the ship that many believed could not be sunk gurgled to the bottom in less than 18 minutes. The deed had been done, and it set into motion great waves of revulsion against the Germans. The waves eventually flooded through Washington and swept up the United States into war. Within days of the declaration, Congress voted $1 billion in credit for England and France. $200 million was sent to England immediately, and it was applied to the Morgan account. The vast quantity of money needed to finance the war was created by the Federal Reserve System, which means it was collected from the Americans through hidden tax called inflation. Within just 5 years, this tax had taken fully 1/2 of all they had saved. Infinitely higher cost of the American blood was added to the bill. Thus, it was that the separate motives of such diverse personalities of Winston Churchill, J.P. Morgan, Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson, all found a common cause into bringing America into World War I. Churchill maneuvered for the military advantage. Morgan sought the profits of war. The House schemed for political power, and Wilson dreamed of a chance to dominate a post-war League of Nations. I hope you guys are liking these episodes. This evening's episode was brought to you by the Six of Coins, Inverted. I have been Dr. John Towers, and this has been the Abracast, and I'll let Hilla tell you what's up.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future. with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot card deck. Your body is your temple, so let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts and other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.